United Nations climate talks at COP26 are underway in Glasgow this week, and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen was one of the notable speakers. In her remarks, Yellen said the U.S. would aim to provide some $500 million per year to a financing mechanism to help developing nations transition to low and zero carbon energy sources. For more on this, we have Yahoo Finance's own Akiko Fujita, who's covering COP26 live from Glasgow. She joins us now. And Akiko, what are the latest details from what Yellen was calling for on climate policy?
Yeah, Emily, let's take a step back to talk about what the focus is today, because it really is all about climate financing. And the overarching question is, who pays for the cost of climate change, particularly in developing countries? As you'll recall, it is developing countries that have taken the brunt of the impact from climate change, a crisis that was largely created by emissions spewed by the richest countries. And while those major economies have vowed to commit $100 billion a year to help these developing countries transition, that hasn't happened more than a decade on after that promise. So today we heard from those leaders, including Janet Yellen, vowing to change things. And we've gotten a number of announcements already today. Number one, we heard from the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer saying that UK would soon require all companies to include financial institutions, I should say, to disclose a detailed plan on how to decarbonize. We also heard from the former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, who, by the way, is now a UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance. He talked about financial institutions that are now overseeing $130 trillion in assets, now committing to shifting assets to reduce their carbon footprint. And then, of course, we heard from Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen saying the U.S. will join the U.K. in that mechanism you mentioned that would essentially issue green bonds to raise finance for this transition to cleaner energy, cleaner technology. Janet Yellen, in speaking to the conference today, urged the private sector to step in and invest in a greener future.
The gap between what governments have and what the world needs is large, and the private sector needs to play a bigger role. The old notions of why the private sector should decarbonize, because planet must be put before profit, are no longer universally true. Many renewables are now cheaper than carbon-based fuel alternatives and have lower long-term operating costs. Other green technologies have cost curves that continue to plunge. In many cases, it is simply cost-effective to go green.
Now, the price tag for what is a 30-decade transition that's about to play out here is a significant one, estimated to be well upwards of $100 trillion. And while we've gotten some big announcements today, the reality is the commercial banks, the biggest banks globally, haven't necessarily come to the table in trying to finance this transition. It's private foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation, as well as some other climate funds that have stepped in to essentially de-risk these investments, to nudge the banks along to come in and invest in this future. I spoke to Foundation President Rajiv Shah about a $100 billion energy fund that was just announced here in partnership with the IKEA Foundation and Jeff Bezos' Global Fund. Take a listen.
Foundations and philanthropies like ours can invest in big, bold efforts and take a lot of risk out of the system for other types of institutions that then can work with us to help reach people who are poor and vulnerable, countries that need energy and climate transitions, and technologies that are unproven but really promising. And that ability to take risk can really be transformational in what we're all trying to do.
That $100 billion fund, we should mention, is by far the largest grant, any kind or investment that the Rockefeller Foundation has announced. So it's certainly a very significant announcement. It does point to the fact that these foundations, these private funds, are the ones that are having to do the heavy lifting right now, while commercial banks slowly ease into what is ultimately a decarbonized future.
Yahoo Finance's Akiko Fujita, thank you so much for bringing us that update from Glasgow.